Hi, welcome back. In this video today we're going to be talking about how to start a chainsaw safely. I'm sure that some of you have probably taken some time and seen the videos that are put out by Steel or some of the other major manufacturers. And they recommend a way of starting a saw that I'm not really sure why they do that. After a lot of years of cutting and teaching other people, including my sons over time, I've come to realize that there isn't a video out there that actually talks about this is how you should start a saw safely. To begin with everything, read your owner's manual. And when you get a new saw, before you take it home, make sure that the person you're buying the saw from, the store, the dealer, this is one of the problems with the big box stores, make sure that they actually start the saw up with you and let you work it a little bit. I'm going to assume that you've also had a chance to use the specific saw and try it out. You wouldn't buy a car without taking it for a test ride. I would recommend that you always use a saw and cut something with it at the dealer before you buy it. Having all of that put in place, make sure also things I would recommend. We're going to pan down to the saw now. Before you start a saw, and today for this one we're going to use one of our smaller ones that we have, a John Sered 2245. You always want to make sure you have the oil in the saw, and you always want to check the gas. The oil is more important than the gas, because if you run out of gas, the saw won't start. You run out of oil, you can burn up your chain and your bar. You always want to make sure that the chain is relatively tight, where it should be. Again, consult your owner's manual to make sure that you're doing what it says it's supposed to. If you have a saw like this that has a decompression valve, before you go to try and turn it over, always push that down and engage it. It makes it a lot easier to pull the saw over. If you have a primer bulb, something that is becoming more standard, I would recommend that you try and look for that on a saw. Make sure that you push this through a few times. It helps to get the gas into the carburetor, which will make it easier for the saw to start. You won't end up having to pull it so many times in the beginning. On this particular saw, this is an integrated both the turn it off and the choke button. On this one you pull it out a little bit and you swing it up. That puts the choke in place. It also does another thing, and this is where I kind of differentiate myself from what I do from what the owner's manual will tell you. When you put it into choke, you also put the saw into a high idle. It's not quite like having it full throttle, but the saw will start really quite fast. And that's the dangerous part that I don't understand why they tell you to do that. You wouldn't start your car when it's cold by putting one foot on the gas pedal and the other on the brake and putting it in gear and expect not to burn the motor up. And that's what you do with the saw. It's also very dangerous because at a high idle, the chain will instantly start to spin pretty violently. They usually ask you, we're going to pan back down to the saw here, they usually ask you to put the brake on so that it locks the chain, which is important to do, but it's not necessary if you start the saw the way that we're going to talk about. If you're starting the saw with a fast idle in place and you've got this locked, again, it's like starting your car with one foot on the gas, one on the brake, and the car is in gear. It's just murder on the little engine. I don't normally do that. I would recommend you to work with your own comfort level. If you feel you want the chain brake on, you can, and that will work fine with the method that I'm going to go through here with you. The other thing to remember is if your saw is not running all that well, this method is sometimes a little more difficult because we're going to start it at a basic idle rather than with the high idle on. If your saw isn't running all that well, bring it back to the dealer. Have them get the saw back into a good function. In our case, more than likely, in most cases, why saws don't run all that well, at least my experience has been, you've done something to the carburetor, and that usually has to do with what you've done with the gas. In other videos, I'm going to talk about how to choose the gas, the additives you should be putting in, because you shouldn't be running just oil and gas anymore. With the new ethanol fuels, you have to add additives. Otherwise, eventually you'll get schmutz that'll build up in the carburetor, and it will screw everything up. Your saw won't run well, it won't start well. We'll talk about that later. So in this saw here, we've got it on the ground. Don't do a drop start, especially when you're starting it cold. Ideally, don't do the drop stops at all, or drop starts at all. I don't recommend them. They're very dangerous. But I do them when the saw is warm, so I won't lie to you. But when it's cold, always start it on the ground. Put the choke and the high idle on, make sure that your decompression's on, and then pull the saw over slowly for 3 or 4 times. You will notice a difference in the resistance. What that's happening in the beginning when you first pull the saw over, and you should pull it slow enough that you feel the sort of chunka with the compression ratio or the compression stroke. What you're feeling is the cylinder moving back and forth without enough lubrication with the oil and gas at the very beginning. Do this slowly a few times and you'll suddenly start to feel the motor turn over much easier, and that's telling you that there is now gas and oil in on the cylinder and also in by the spark plug. Pulling it really hard and fast from the word go is only going to tire you out, and it puts a lot of stress on the motor for no reason. So pull it over slowly 3 or 4 times. Once you feel the resistance drop a lot, now the saw is ready to start. The way we're going to do it is we're going to pull it over again additionally another probably 3 or 4 times until the saw sort of sputters a bit. It usually won't start completely. It will just sputter a bit. Some people call it a burp, and it will then stall. That's where you want to go, and that's where we stop at that point, and we will take the high idle off and the choke off. So we'll pull it a few times until it gives us a sputter. And it will stall. That's what it should do, because with the choke a lot of times it won't run. Once we get to that point, you then, if we'll pan down here, you take this off of the choke. And almost every saw that I'm familiar with, you also additionally need to pull the trigger once, and a lot of times you'll hear a faint click from inside the saw. That is turning off the high idle. Right now the choke is off, but the throttle is partially engaged. If I were to pull it a couple more times, the saw would start, and it would start at a very fast rate, which would immediately start to spin the chain. That's the danger in it all. At this point, you take it off the choke, you pull the trigger, and you get the high idle out of there. Now, when you're actually going to start all of these too, I always recommend that you would put your foot into underneath here. These are all made to have a place for your foot to hold there. That holds the saw in place. We'll now pull it a few more times until the saw starts, but it will start at just an idle. If your idle is adjusted appropriately, the chain will not move. The saw will start and idle appropriately, safely, and the saw won't get away from you. At that point, leave the saw to idle for 2 or 3 minutes. Let it warm up. These are a small motor that work very hard. Don't try and use it when it's cold. Let it warm up, and then you're ready to cut. So we'll pull it a few more times. Again, re-engage the compression release valve because it's probably popped open when it did the little sputter. And you pull it a few more times, and the saw will start. Okay, so now that we've let the saw run for a few minutes, it's up to temp and everything is ready to go. What I usually recommend at that point is you pick the saw up at a slow idle, making sure that there's nothing around you and that you're not going to hit anything with the chain. Run it at a little bit of a faster speed so that the chain starts to spin. Most saws don't pump out oil into the bar unless it's actually turning the chain. So you run it a little bit, let the oil get around in on the chain and on the bar, and then you're ready to go. Always practice safe practices when you're using a saw, because remember, there's no learning curve on a saw. You either cut safely or somebody gets hurt. If you have any questions, put them in the comments section and I'll be happy to get back to you. And thanks for watching, everyone.